This video is the video that you can be listening to read along with me for the City Parks, Wildlife Islands, and a Sea of Cement data nugget activity. Remember that while you are reading, you should be doing some annotations while you're doing this, so you may need to pause the video occasionally in order to annotate the text appropriately according to what your teacher is asking you to do. All right, here we go. Research background. For most of our existence, humans have lived in rural, natural places. However, more and more people continue to move into cities and urban areas. The year 2008 marked the first time ever in human history that the majority of people on the planet lived in cities. The movement of humans from rural areas into cities has two important effects. First, the demand that people place on the environment is becoming very intense in certain spots. Second, for many people, the city is becoming the main place where they experience nature and interact with wildlife on a regular basis. Okay, try to scroll down here a second. Okay, Remington and Grant are city dwellers and have been their entire lives. Remington grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Grant is from Cleveland, Ohio. In Tulsa, Remington fell in love with nature while running on the trails of city parks during cross-country and track practices. Grant developed a love for nature while fishing and hiking in the Cleveland Metro Parks in Ohio. These experiences led them to study wildlife found in certain environments because they believe that the cities can be places where both humans and wildlife thrive. However, to make this belief a reality, scientists must understand how wildlife are using habitats in the city. This knowledge will provide land managers the information that they need to create park systems that support all types of species. However, almost all research done on wildlife takes place in natural areas, like national parks, so there's currently very little known about wildlife habitats in urban areas. To address this gap in knowledge, Remington, Grant, and their colleagues conduct ecological research on the urban wildlife populations in the Cleveland Metro Parks. The Cleveland Metro Parks are a collection of wooded areas that range in size, usage, and maintenance. Some are highly used small parks with mowed grass, while others are large rural parks with thousands of acres of forest and miles of winding trails. As they began studying the metro parks, they noticed that the parks were like little islands of wildlife habitat within large seas of buildings, pavement, houses, and people. This reminded Remington and Grant of a fundamental theory in ecology, the theory of island biogeography. This theory has two components: size and isolation of the islands. The first predicts that larger islands will have higher biodiversity because there are more resources and space to support more wildlife than smaller areas. The second is that islands farther away from the mainland will have lower biodiversity because the isolated islands are harder for wildlife to reach. Remington and Grant wondered if they could address this first part of the theory in the Cleveland Metro Parks. These parks come in all different sizes. If the theory holds for the Metro Parks, it could help them to figure out where most species live in the park system and help managers better maximize biodiversity. It would also provide an important link between ecological research conducted in natural areas and urban ecology. To evaluate whether the theory of island biogeography holds true in urban areas, Remington and Grant set up 104 wildlife cameras throughout the parks. These cameras photograph animals when triggered by motion. They use these photographs to identify the locations of wildlife in the parks and to get a count on how many individuals there are, known as their abundance. With this data, they tested whether the size of the park would influence biodiversity as predicted by the theory of island biogeography. One challenge with measuring biodiversity is that it means different things to different people. Remington and Grant looked at two common measures of biodiversity. First, species richness, which is the number of different species observed in the park. Second, they calculated the Shannon-Weiner Index of Biodiversity for each park. This index incorporates both species richness and species evenness. Species evenness tells us whether the abundance of each species are similar or if one type is most common and the others are rare. Evenness is important because it tells you whether a park has lots of animals from many different species or if most animals are from a single species. If a park has greater evenness of species, the Shannon-Weiner Index will be higher. The scientific question is, how does the theory of island biogeography help explain the distribution of wildlife in the Cleveland Metro Parks? And then you're supposed to look at the hypothesis. You're supposed to find the two hypotheses in the research background and underline them. A hypothesis, remember, is a proposed explanation for an observation which can be tested with experimentation or other types of studies. All right, and so this is exploring the measures of biodiversity. The scientists used two measures of biodiversity in their study, species richness and species evenness. The Shannon-Weiner Index takes into account both of these measures. For example, consider the two hypothetical parks below, A and B. Both parks have the same number of individuals, and both have 4 species represented: deer, raccoons, possum, and squirrels. But do the two parks have the same level of biodiversity? All right, and then you're supposed to go on and answer those questions. And then there's some data presented to you there for various different parks, given the park size, given their measure of species richness. Remember, that would be the number of different species that they found in that area. And then the Shannon-Weiner Index that also takes into account the evenness, so how even the various different species are, or is there just one species that is predominant? If there's only one species mostly, then that value will be lower. All right, so then you can move on to identifying the independent variables or variable and the dependent variables, and then there's information that you're going to be making in the graph. So you're going to be making a couple of graphs. Follow the directions indicated, and then it's a claim evidence reasoning.